Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
We're chicken littles, the sky is falling, it's all bad. I'm grateful for the fact that being a student of history permits me to have a kind of sense that the human race will figure this out.
Ken Burns, filmmaker, chronicler of America, and now telling the story of the American Revolution.
I think gratitude is the missing ingredient in our degraded political lives these days. Everything is binary, and it's not. It's so complicated, and yet I have an essential optimism.
From Bloomberg Weekend, this is the Mishal Husain Show. I'm Mishal Husain. Ken Burns has been working on stories of America for nearly 50 years. He's made epic documentaries on the American Civil War, the Vietnam War, the US and the Holocaust. And his style, bringing old photographs and documents to life, is what led Steve Jobs to name an Apple video editing feature the Ken Burns Effect in his honor. Now, the filmmaker has turned his lens onto the United States' origin story, the American Revolution, with a mammoth 12-hour series on PBS, American Public Broadcasting. And even if you think you know everything necessary about the Founding Fathers, the Brits versus the colonies, I think you'll be surprised and enriched by what you're about to hear. This conversation also comes right up to the present day. And given it's Thanksgiving weekend, it felt right to hear from America's best-known documentary maker with his take on his country then and now. So here's Ken Burns telling me first what he discovered as he investigated the revolutionary story.
I had no idea of the complexity, the variety of individuals, the sense that it was a bloody civil war in ways that our civil war is merely a sectional war, that it's a world war, a global war, maybe the fifth global war for the prize of North America, that it has the big ideas and all the famous, for Americans, founding fathers, the bold-faced names, if you will, but also hundreds of other people that are engaged in it who are important and give dynamics and dimension and complexity to the story. And that's all we want from our stories. We don't want a superficial Madison Avenue sanitized version of our past. We want a complete one. Everyone wants that. It doesn't matter about politics. You just want dramatic stories. And we have a sign, a neon sign in our editing room that says, it's complicated, because in my business, the art has to be subservient to the facts. And when you learn new facts, and sometimes they're contradictory, you have to find a way that your narrative can tolerate them and understand them. And when, unfortunately, we live in a media world where everything's a 1 or a 0, and we live in a political world where everything is one way or the other. It's a binary that does not exist, but is artificially created for the simplicity, the laziness, the cynicism of what's going on. But telling a complex story escapes the specific gravity of cynicism and offers something in return, something rich and something where you can say the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
And the series is out now in all its complexity, but you will have known as you did it that it's a more fractious time in America compared to the end of the Obama presidency when you start out.
Yes.
And indeed, in an executive order, the White House said earlier this year that they were against telling history in a way that casts the founding principles in a negative light.
Well, I certainly haven't done that. I've put them in a very, very positive light. I've just put them in the correct light, which is the engagement of all the characters. It is possible, I assume, to make this a one-act, one-room play where it all takes place in Philadelphia, but it doesn't give you the dynamism. It doesn't understand the underdog story that this is. I mean, on April 19, 1775, when British troops open up on American militia on Lexington Green in Massachusetts, the chances of their success is 0. And 6.5 long years later at Yorktown, that British army is surrendering. And how that happens is 40 battles, enormous social and political, even religious change within the colonies. So you have this complex dynamic of the 500,000 people out of the 3 million who are free or enslaved Africans. You have Native Americans either coexisting, assimilated with the colonists, and then those nations that are as distinct and as important as, say, a France or a Prussia is on the world scene, that have maintained relationships for centuries.
And one of the many things that really interested and intrigued me about this series is realizing that this revolutionary spirit on the part of the colonies, how their ideas were influenced by the Native American nations, that Native American nations had what we would recognize today as a union in a way that the 13 colonies really didn't until quite late.
It's really remarkable. At the very, very beginning of the film, there is a group of 6 native nations, first 5 and then 6, which is often called the Iroquois Confederacy. They called it the Haudenosaunee. It permitted each of those nations to sort of retain their identity. It's sort of like the European Union, and at the same time could economically and diplomatically and militarily have a union. And Benjamin Franklin sees this 20 years before the Revolution and says, I want that. That's what we need. From New Hampshire to Georgia, the 13 colonies, we need that. And he gets people to sign up for his plan of union in Albany 20 years before the Revolution, 1754. And then they go home to try to sell it, and nobody wants to give up any autonomy. So the plan dies, but it gets resurrected as the revolution begins to become a shooting war. And it's very interesting. It's also, I have to say, the Enlightenment. And the Americans are reading, they're very literate, in some ways, percentage-wise, more literate than the British population. They're freer. They own land in ways that ordinary folks in Britain do not own land. They pay less taxes. They got great health. Their literacy is second only to Scandinavia. And they're reading Montesquieu. They're reading the French philosophers of the Enlightenment. They're reading Locke and Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers. And so when you marry this idea of a practical example sitting at your Western doorstep of the possibility of union, and you merge it with these arguments you're having with your own countrymen that suddenly get blown out into universal rights, yikes. And they're very powerful. The word liberty means something to everybody. It means something to George Washington, who owns hundreds of human beings, and Thomas Jefferson, who owns hundreds of human beings. But it also means something to those hundreds of human beings. And it means something to women, who are a majority of the population. And it means something to Native Americans. And that animating spirit makes the American Revolution not just this important origin story for the United States. It makes it one of the most important events in all of world history, because that revolution is going to spawn 200 years of revolutions all around the globe. It has a kind of force and a power that is going to destroy the French monarchy. It's going to change Europe. It's going to change Latin and South America, and then later Asia and Africa. And it comes from the idea of this anti-colonial movement that, strange to say in this day and age, the United States invented.
And yet, when that anti-colonial movement is ultimately successful in 1776 and then finally against the British a few years later, what it results in is the westward expansion, which dispossesses Native Americans of their land.
Exactly.
And those African Americans who were runaway slaves are hunted down. And George Washington, the great hero, if there is one, although there are many of your story,
yes,
is keeping those runaway slaves imprisoned so that their owners can come back and get them.
This is the story of human beings, the contradictions, the hypocrisies, all of that is there. We don't have a country without George Washington, but yes, he owns other human beings. He wants those escaped enslaved people to be returned to their owners. They don't make George Washington the head of the Eastern Seaboard Army. They make him the head of the Continental Army, which is directed by the Continental Congress. They know where they're going. So first of all, the irony that settlers dumping the tea, colonists dumping the tea in Boston Harbor, are crudely dressed as Native Americans. Every school kid in America knows that. And then when you ask them why, they say, to put the blame on the Native Americans. That's not the reason. It's this attempt, so ironic and so bittersweet and so complicated, so moving in a way. They're trying to tell Britain, we're not of you. We're not of the mother country anymore. We're aboriginal. like the people we've spent the last 150 years dispossessing of their land so that we can have these 13 colonies, and the people that we're going to spend the next 150 years getting rid of all the rest of the land all the way to the Pacific. So there's ironies throughout.
Well, don't you struggle with that hypocrisy?
No, this is what do you mean? There's a wonderful moment when the great scholar Annette Gordon Reed, who is a Black woman, says, that slavery bound Thomas Jefferson's life from beginning to end. We're in the middle of a section on the Declaration of Independence where he is declaring that all men are created equal. We hold these truths to be self-evident, he says. They're not self-evident. These are brand new in the world, that all men are created equal. And he knows slavery is wrong. George Washington knows slavery is wrong. And she said, well, how could you do something if you knew it was wrong? She said, that's the human question for all of us. She's not taking Thomas Jefferson off the hook, or by extension, George Washington off the hook. She's putting us on the hook for our tisk-tisk presentism about how we're so different. We're all complicated. This is what your William Shakespeare has given us in so many ways, what's going on, the contradictions. Here's the good news, though. Those words, when Thomas Jefferson meant them, he meant all men of property free of debt who were white. We don't mean that anymore. And everyone who heard those words began to argue for something that changed the world. Now, the second he says the word all, slavery's over. Now, it will take 69 years before that happens. Women will have to wait just an excruciatingly, impossibly long 144 years in our country to receive suffrage. But those walls are broken down. They're done. They're over. And you could extend it to all other kinds of things, child labor, gay marriage, whatever it might be. This has
So they start something by saying the words all, they start something even though they're not prepared to deliver it themselves.
The late historian Bernard Balin, who died at 101, God bless him, and we interviewed him when he was 98 or 99, says nobody talked about slavery as an evil before the revolution. There were people who spoke to its evil, but it was not part of the common conversation. The second the revolution started, and for every moment through to our Civil War, it was the number one topic in America. So by bringing up what you're calling the hypocrisy of these natural rights by people who owned other human beings. Just because Jefferson didn't see the hypocrisy, I mean, he did see the hypocrisy, he just couldn't act on it. There's too much money to be made in slavery. And may I point out that the British Empire's wealth, its profit centers are in the Caribbean. Only South Carolina is profitable. We're just the most populous, and we also are the most literate, and we make things. And so we're great trading partners with Britain before the revolution. But the 13 colonies in the Caribbean, like Jamaica and Barbados, which are 90% enslaved people, that's where the engine of wealth for the British Empire comes from. And so when we deal with hypocrisy, it's kind of like saying oxygen. This is like human behaviors. I mean, there would not be a William Shakespeare if there was not hypocrisy and irony and contradiction and undertow, not between people, but within individuals. So you can see that in Washington. You can see that in Jefferson. You can see that in many of the founding fathers, though the Adamses were vehemently opposed to slavery. And John Adams's wife, Abigail, who may be the best writer of the whole lot, is from the very get-go just totally uncomfortable with the idea that we're going to be talking about liberty and we can't rid ourselves of this horrific hypocrisy right in our own midst. So this is what makes this story dramatic.
Ken, I hear you on the universality of hypocrisy. My family are from India and Pakistan, and the impact of the revolution on the British as far as India was concerned is that no way are we going to lose India.
Oh, right.
Look at what the Americans did to us. We're not going to have the same thing happen again. Can I tell you what my connection is to Lexington Green and to 1775?
Yes, please. Do you have one?
I do have one, which I had no idea about until I was on a TV ancestry program. And they traced 6 generations back. One of my forefathers, Michael Farley, was the head of the Massachusetts militia. His 4 sons were all soldiers of the Revolution, one of them killed. And essentially the link to me is that one of the grandsons ends up in India. So goes off by 1820 to seek his fortune. But it gives me this connection to exactly the period that you're talking about. And I have to reconcile myself to the fact that when they were fighting for their liberty, they didn't mean everyone's liberty.
I learned that I have, on my mother's side, an enslaved person. It was a household, one person. And I took that with equanimity. The thing that really bothered me was that I have an ancestor also on my mother's side in Massachusetts named Eldad Tupper, who had to move to New Brunswick because he refused to sign a loyalty oath after the revolution and had been a loyalist throughout that. I do have one saving grace, perhaps, for those of you in the UK, that I am also related to Robert Burns, the national poet of Scotland, who still says in his poem To a Louse, one of my favorite lines in the English language, "Oh, would some power the gift to give us to see ourselves as others see us." And that becomes an animating part of how we tell stories, not sort of imprisoned by the binary that we've been talking about, but tolerant of or just aware of all of these contradictions and undertow, which makes drama more interesting and makes us able to deal with one another. If it's that binary, you can't be married. If it's that binary, you can't raise a child. But somehow we've permitted our politics to descend to this, abysmal level of one thing or the other that actually, frankly, doesn't exist in nature.
Can I understand a bit more, Ken, about your own nature and the story of how you came to do this work that you have over decades now? You started with the Brooklyn Bridge documentary, and the Civil War, of course, was an amazing American TV moment. One of our producers was 9 when it came out, and she remembers everyone sitting and watching it. So how did that work begin? What was it in your early life that led you to it?
As many things for many people, the thing that has been the most significant for my growth has had to do with loss. My mother had cancer, began when I was 2 or 3. She died when I was 11, just a couple months short of my 12th birthday. I remember sometime after my 12th birthday, I saw my father looking at an old movie and crying. And I'd never seen my dad cry, not when my mother was sick, and not when she died, or not at the impossibly sad funeral. And the film was Sir Carol Reed's Odd Man Out, about the Irish Troubles, starring James Mason. It's a beautiful film, still works today. And I realized that film had given him a safe haven that nowhere else in his life could he express these emotions. And I was sitting there late at night with him. It was a school night. He was letting me stay up, and he cried. And I just went, at that moment, I want to be a filmmaker. And later on in life, my late father-in-law, who was an eminent psychologist, I said, I could never be aware of the date that my mother died, April 28th. It'd always be approaching and then, receding, but I was never present. He said, I bet you blew out your candles on your birthday cake, wishing she'd come back. And I said, how'd you know? He said, look what you do for a living. You wake the dead. You make Abraham Lincoln and Jackie Robinson come alive. Who do you think you're really trying to wake up? But I then, by 39 or 40, I began to really work to understand what it was that I had not dealt with as a little boy with this tremendous loss. And it enriched my work even more. But it's born in tragedy. It's born in loss. My mother's gift, in a funny, perverse way, was dying. I don't want her to be gone. There's not a day that I don't think of her. My oldest daughter named her first child after her, my first grandchild, and it is a poignant and positive response in the middle of a lot of draped black funereal crepe that has attended my life like the Spanish moss and the live oaks in the South. But it's born of loss, and it's interesting.
Your mother's been gone 60 years, I think.
60 and a half. It's way too long. I will tell you that it is way too long. I talk about this with my brother. It's funny. My dad died much later. He had moved from daddy to dad. She never left mommy. So you have two 70 men in their 70s who refer to their mother as mommy. And we talk about that, every time we talk. We just say mommy, and it just is what it is. She left at a time when he was 10 and I was 11.
Do you think you're still grieving?
Yes. The half-life of grief is endless. I think that's true.
The style that you have made your trademark, Ken, the use of paintings, fragments of letters, photographs with your more recent work where you zoom in and you're panning across, you're using music, you're using sound effects. How much of that was born of necessity in that, let's take the Civil War documentary, you didn't have a lot of great visuals to work with?
Well, we had a lot of photographs, and that's where the American Revolution is at an even greater deficit, because photographs are real. You show a picture of Abraham Lincoln with his general at Antietam, and you just know what's going on. But you don't have that. The variety of portraits of Washington are wildly varied. Some look cartoonish, some don't look at all like him, some do look like him. And so you have to figure out a way, in this case, to make them come alive. It's the filmmaker's problem. Like, you have to have a complex sound effects track. In this case, in addition to a third-person narrator, I have been pioneering since the first film on Brooklyn Bridge, first-person voices read by the finest actors in the world. And I would submit that the cast list for this film is better than any film or television series that's ever happened. I think that Sir Kenneth Branagh could have read every single part except the female parts, and maybe I'm selling him short, but also Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep and Paul Giamatti and Laura Linney and Claire Danes. And I've probably listed a fifth of the voices that make this. Jeff Daniels, Josh Brolin.
Josh Brolin, who's the voice of Washington, right? And I wonder, just let us into how you direct them, because I think that you are very specific on how you want these people to sound. Yeah. So how do you know that that's how Washington would have come across?
I don't know. Sometimes it's hard. And Washington was particularly hard. Last year, I was at the Rome Film Festival, and I was flying back home, and Dune 2 was playing, and I was falling asleep and nodding out. But at one point, I just sat up straight because I heard Josh's voice. He's in both the Dune films. And I just said, okay, let's give this a try. I said, look, as everybody, I've told everybody this, you don't have to project. This is not the theater. It's almost like the way if you're reading to your kids or your grandkids, you actually lower your voice, which brings people closer. And so I said, you need to just inhabit the words. And in the case of George Washington, you have an impossible task. This is an opaque and unknowable person by design. He kept that rectitude so firmly there, but there is in the writing little glimpses. So I need you to be both opaque, but give me the little bits where you feel the emotion, you feel the passion. And he did it fantastically. I told Tom Hanks, I'd make you George Washington in a second. He said, but then everybody would be saying, oh, Tom Hanks is George Washington. I said, right. So I gave him 14 different voices, and every 14 is in the film. He is such a good reader that he actually slips in and hides with perfection behind the 8 or 10 people that he plays in these 14 quotes. And I just have to tell you that when you record voices with people, not all of them get in. In editing, you whittle them down, but every one that he read is in. And I've worked with him now, it's close to 25 years, and he is so talented and so generous that if you wanted somebody to read the back of your cereal box or the phone book, he'd be the guy to do it.
What you're saying about Tom Hanks does explain to me why I knew he was in the series. And as I watched the episodes, I was like, which one is Tom Hanks? Because I couldn't recognize his voice. Now so I understand.
I'll tell him that, because this is exactly what I love.
You did bring in one new thing in this series you hadn't done before, Ken, and that's the reenactments. There's a lot of reenactments. Why? Is it because in the TikTok generation, you need a new visual device?
It's that I have no photographs. I have no newsreels. We spent more than 5 years filming reenactment groups in French and British and militia and Continental and Native American, Black troops, whatever, women, children that are always there in the battlefield. And we collected a critical mass of them so that we could use them as if we'd gone to the National Archives to pick up the photographs of that. We treated them in a very impressionistic way. We filmed them at every time of day and night, usually at dawn or dusk. We don't see faces. We see silhouettes. We see cannon firing. And all of that means that we're not asking them to reenact a specific battle. We're asking them to participate and to give a sense. And if you add complex, in some cases, 150 different soundtracks, along with the music, the third-person narrator read by Peter Coyote, and then some of the voices that you and I have been talking about, then you get a sense that you're there. And there's a coldness that you can feel in the winter scenes. There's a hotness you can feel in the summer scenes. When 20 British soldiers were dying in the march across New Jersey every day just of heat. The live cinematography is the key to this, as are maps. Some of them just leaving the old maps alone. They're beautiful works of art. Some adding arrows, some extruding them and making them dimensional. So there's lots of ways to bring to life, to wake the dead, as my late father-in-law said.
Now, I'm going to read the words that you put right at the end of the series. And forgive me, because clearly I'm not Meryl Streep or Laura Linney or Claire Danes or any of the amazing voices that you had in. But these are such striking lines. Benjamin Rush in 1787 saying, "The American war is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. On the contrary, nothing but the first act of the great drama is closed. It remains yet to establish and perfect our new forms of government. Patriots, come forward. Your country demands your services." Hear her proclaiming in sighs and groans, in her governments, in her finances, in her trade, in her manufactures, in her morals, and in her manners. The revolution is not over. I mean, I'm feeling emotional reading these words, and I'm not even
I am
American.
emotional. Ed Norton, the great actor, reads that as he does many characters in the film.
But Ken, are you saying the revolution is not over today?
Yes, in all of the spirit that moved you in that moment. There's something interesting. We sometimes focus on the phrase pursuit of happiness and argue about happiness means the right to make as much money as I want. This is what worried the founding fathers. They thought the pursuit of happiness was lifelong learning. But the key word here is pursuit. This is a process story. The Declaration has it. We're in pursuit of happiness. The Constitution, 11 years later, has it. A more perfect union. We're a nation in the process of becoming. So everyone knew that these were original documents, the Constitution, that would not be ratified if it wasn't immediately amended by some things, some basic rights that all of the people who fought for it wanted to have, and that we would continue to be tinkering with this machine to perfect it. So that meant in 1789, when the United States government actually took the Constitution of 2 years before and put it in action, it meant all white men, could vote, right? Who were 21 years old. We don't mean that now. And so the story of the American adventure, which Benjamin Rush understood right away, he's saying this is an open-ended thing. We are perfectible. And that is a key thing. More often than not, people say this is it. And just as the Bible, the Old Testament says in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun, most human beings believe that nothing would ever change. There are people from Wales and England and Scotland and Ireland who have worked dependent land for 1,000 years. Their whole families have worked it for somebody else. And they've come here and they now own a plot of land, maybe taken from Native Americans, but they own it. And they feel this sense of the possibility of things actually changing. And I think what is, in some ways, one of the biggest takeaways is the perfectibility of human beings, the improvement. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that's the beauty of Benjamin Rush's statements. It doesn't mean you have to kill people every 20 years. Jefferson famously said many years later that the tree of liberty should be watered with the blood of tyrants and patriots every 20 years. And you kind of go, no, you don't need to do the violence. This is what human beings always do.
But I guess I'm asking, are there aspects of what has happened this year that you're struggling with?
No, I have to be disciplined. That sign, it's complicated. Our famous satirist, Mark Twain, says, history doesn't repeat itself, which of course it doesn't. No event has happened twice, but it rhymes. That there's nothing new under the sun. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. Suggesting human nature doesn't change, and it basically doesn't. But I think what happens is you have to, as a filmmaker, be disciplined. The rhymes that were happening when we began this project, when Barack Obama was president, changed in the next year and the next year and the next year. So they're different rhymes. And if you pay attention to them, you date your film. But today is a school day in the United States, and hundreds of classrooms are looking at my 35-year-old film on the Civil War, that Lewis and Clark film that we made, the film on the Roosevelts, on World War II, on jazz, on baseball, and on our recent film on the U.S. and the Holocaust and many others, because they're evergreen, because we did not succumb to the desire to say, isn't this so much like today?
But what about your next work? That's what I wonder about, because you've always worked with PBS.
I'm working on several things, yeah.
PBS is, President Trump wants to end federal funding for public broadcasting.
He did. He killed the corporation he didn't. The Congress killed the corporation for public broadcasting, and it was an incredibly short-sighted thing. It will hurt rural stations more than us. I took a big hit. Money that had already been authorized and appropriated for future projects that I'm working on and have been working on for years has disappeared. I'll have to fundraise. PBS had to lay off a lot of people, but they'll be around. They'll continue. I'll continue.
So will you find other sources of funding?
Of course I will. I just will work hard.
Where do you make that up from?
Just places, foundations, individuals of wealth who have always contributed. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which was eliminated, was about 20% of my budget, equal to our corporate underwriter, but many other people will fill the gap. I'm worried about the next person coming up who's not going to be able to be funded. I'm worried about those rural stations. Sometimes the PBS station, it's the largest network in the country. There are 338 individual stations. That's the only signal they get. And so there'll be a news desert. Nobody will be covering the school board or the city council meeting. They won't have that emergency signal. So it's just, it was an unfortunate and unnecessary sort of political gesture. And maybe things will change and it will be resurrected. And I feel optimistic that in a selfish way, I'll be able to go on and PBS will continue. And it's been the only place that could have put on my films. I could, with my reputation, go to other places and get all the money I need to do the revolution, $30 million plus, but they wouldn't give me 10 years to do it. Right?
Yeah.
They want it in a year and a half. And I don't make films that are this complicated and this deep in that amount of time. I don't know how to do it. And my hats are off to the people who can. But I think the reason I occupy a position as I do in my country is because I spend that time to do it right, that I don't put any of my personal politics in it, and that I speak to everybody. And there is in this film something for everybody here, not because we're trying to be all things to be all people, but if you tell a good story, it would be like saying, well, Shakespeare's only good for liberal Democrats. That's poppycock, right? He appeals to this day because of the truths he was able to get to everybody.
What stories are you telling next?
Well, we're working on a film. We have been for several years on the history of LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the New Deal. His hero was FDR. It's a very complicated thing. The Vietnam War curtailed that. We're doing a film on Reconstruction, which is the most misunderstood period in American history, that post-war period where the North was attempting to rebuild the South and integrate Black Americans into it. And its collapse is the disaster. However, Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind suggest that the actual Reconstruction, the attempt at equalization, was the bad thing. And that in both of those films, the Ku Klux Klan, which is our own homegrown Al-Qaeda or ISIS, were the heroes of that story, and when in fact they are the villains of that story.
Ken, as you are our Thanksgiving episode, can I ask you, this Thanksgiving weekend, what are you grateful for?
Well, I'm grateful that I am an American. I am incredibly patriotic, as my children and my grandchildren will tell you, probably with no small amount of discomfort, that every year before we eat on the 4th of July, I make them listen to me read the Declaration of Independence. Each time I get a little choked up, as you were and I were, listening to Benjamin Rush's words. And now my kids will offer other readings, or I'll give it to my grandkids, or learning to read something else. I'm very, very grateful. And I think gratitude is the missing ingredient in our degraded political lives these days. Everything is binary, and it's not. It's so complicated. And yet I have as history will do, an essential optimism. I'm grateful for the fact that being a student of history permits me to have a kind of sense that the human race will figure this out, that the imbalances of the moment, and we're all so narcissistic, our moment is the worst, we're chicken littles, the sky is falling, it's all bad, that I can point out in this American Revolution, it's much more a division back then, that it is a civil war, that it is a global war. And maybe by seeing their own reflection in these historical figures, well-known or not well-known, gives you a chance to realize that for the first time in human history, people were no longer subjects under authoritarian rule, but citizens with all of the responsibilities attendant to that. And it's been on the whole, with lots of problems, a positive in the course of human events, as Thomas Jefferson would say.
Ken Burns, thank you for taking us into the past and talking about the present as well. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving to you.
And that's the Mishal Husain Show for this week. Do subscribe if you haven't already. You'll know as soon as we have a new episode that way. Thank you for the comments, ratings, and for your emails. You can send a message to mishalshow@bloomberg.net. If you want to see the written versions of these conversations with my notes, they are at bloomberg.com/weekend. And you can also watch them on YouTube and on Bloomberg TV. Our producers are Jessica Beck and Chris Martlew. Guest booking is by Dave Warren. Social media by Alex Morgan. Our sound engineer is Richard Ward. Video editing by Toby Babalola. Our executive producer is Louisa Lewis. At Bloomberg Weekend, editorial director of audio and special projects is Brendan Francis Newnham. And our executive editor is Catherine Bell. Music is by Bart Warshaw. And we'd also like to thank Alana Susnow, Summer Sadi, and Sage Bauman. And also thank you for listening. Until next weekend, goodbye.